What happened here?
Well, in 1999, a 16-inch pipeline upstream here ruptured and dumped 250,000 gallons of unleaded fuel into this creek. It ran all the way down past here, almost 1.5 miles, and when it found an ignition source, it blew up. Explosions running up this creek all the way up to the ignition source in the park.
What happened here in Bellingham, Washington, when you heard the news in San Bruno? What went through your mind?
Well, it was really a pretty emotional moment when I got a call that this had happened in San Bruno, because 10 years ago when it happened in Bellingham, we did a lot of efforts, and our rallying cry was here to make sure this never happens anywhere else again. And then here San Bruno happens, a tragedy, maybe even greater than what happened here in Bellingham. So it really took the wind out of me that night when I heard that.
When you look at what happened in San Bruno, were the lessons from Bellingham not learned at all?
Well, I think some lessons have been learned, some regulations have improved, but certainly there's things that we said after Bellingham, we said them after the big Carlsbad explosion, we've said them after numerous tragedies that need to be fixed, and those lessons still haven't been addressed.
Now, what happened in Bellingham? The pipe ruptured just like it did in San Bruno. Does it matter about really the age of the pipelines, or is it really the maintenance and care of them?
Well, age is certainly a factor, because if you have older pipelines, it has more threats on it that you have to pay attention to. But in reality, it's how well operated, maintained, and inspected the pipeline are is a bigger factor on the safety of the overall pipeline.
One of the things we've learned is how little the first responders knew about where these pipelines were, and even consumers, homeowners, didn't know. How important is that?
Well, I think that's a major lesson that we hear after every one of these incidents. People in the neighborhood say, we had no idea we had a pipeline that in our area. And the regulations require that the companies do a lot of active education to make sure people do know about the pipeline. So it certainly is a lesson that the pipeline companies aren't doing a very good job or a very effective job of that education. And it's a major thing that if people knew about the pipelines in their area, they might respond differently, and they might prevent tragedies from happening if it's something like excavation near a pipeline.
Now, in 1999, not only did we have what happened in Bellingham, but we had what happened in Carlsbad, New Mexico. Have we not learned anything since?
Well, there's some lessons we haven't learned. I mean, the Carlsbad accident, there was lots of discussion after that about the need for automatic valves. Same here in Bellingham. That's still not a standard that's in the regulation. There's lots of discussion about the need for greater leak detection, so a company can shut off the pipeline before it becomes a huge incident. That's something that still hasn't been addressed.
But PG&E was supposed to repair that particular pipeline back in 2009, but the California PUC said you don't need to do it until 2013. Is state regulation too lax on the utilities?
Well, the state regulators have to obey the minimum federal standards. I think the issue is whether both the federal and the state regulators have enough resources to actually be able to look over the shoulder of all the millions of miles of these pipelines and make sure the pipeline companies are doing what the regulations say. That's one of the, I think, take-home messages, that we need to ensure that the regulators have the resources they need.
We've learned one of the things that California has said is that they didn't have enough regulators, and that because of the budget crisis that they have right now, regulators who are supposed to be inspecting these pipelines literally are going out on their own dime, on their own credit card, to inspect them. At what point does the federal government have to step in and say, this is our responsibility and we're going to make sure this is funded?
Right, the federal government ultimately has a responsibility, so they should keep an eye on the state regulators, but they're spread thin too, so all the regulators are spread thin, and there's not much transparency about what's really going on as far as those inspections go. There's no way for you and I to look to see what's being inspected and to know whether a good job's being done. The federal government audits the state regulators every year, but those types of audits aren't available to you and I to look at to know whether the states are up to snuff and doing a good job, or whether they really do need some help. PHMSA has another layer of responsibility, because they're the government supposedly watching out for us. So if they don't have the resources to ensure that pipelines are safe, they need to make that clear to Congress and get more resources.
And one of the things we've been aware of is that, like MMS, PHMSA was using API guidelines, American Petroleum Institute guidelines, to instruct the regulators on how to inspect pipelines. Is the industry too close to the regulators, in your view?
Well, certainly 10 years ago when the Bellingham tragedy happened here, it was hard to tell where the regulators stopped and the industry started. It was such a cozy relationship. I think that's improved quite a bit in the last 10 years, but there's still instances, like you said, there's numerous standards that are written by the industry that and then are adopted into regulations. And to make it even worse, the public can't even see those standards without paying groups like the American Petroleum Institute to get your hands on it. So you can't even read what's in the regulations without paying the industry to get your hands on it.
So in your view, PHMSA is not necessarily an MMS that was too close to the industry was regulating, but it's close?
I think, 10 years ago they were an MMS. I think they've gone a long ways. And PHMSA's done a pretty good job of making a lot more information transparent. The states have a lot of ways to catch up to meet even what PHMSA's done at this point.
Let me switch gears and talk about how industry maintains its pipelines. We've heard a lot about how many of these pipelines, especially the ones in San Bruno, especially the one here in Bellingham, were simply not piggable. You couldn't put a smart pig or a pig into the pipe. How critical is that if you can't put something like a pig into a pipe and inspect it?
Well, clearly the smart pig internal inspection technology is the gold standard for how you know whether your pipe has problems or not. And because of the way regulations are dickered with the industry, other technologies were allowed to be used that aren't as good. So we think it's critical that, especially in high population areas, you try to get those pipelines redone so they are piggable and so companies really do know what the problems are.
But the problem in San Bruno was that there was a 90-degree bend in that particular pipe, and you can't put a pig in a pipe with a turn like that. How is a company supposed to maintain the structural integrity of a pipe if it can't put a pig in it?
Well, a lot of companies, and I think even PG&E in some places, are retrofitting those pipelines to take out those bends and those different sizes to make sure that they can run the latest inspection technologies.
One of the things we always hear about is the U.S. regulators generally don't communicate with other regulators in other countries. Are other countries doing things, perhaps, with pipeline safety that we should be paying attention to?
Well, I think so. We tried to do a study a few years ago on what the best standards were in pipeline safety, and certainly there's other countries. Canada does some things differently that are good, other countries do. We couldn't find that one country was better than others, and in integrity management that was kicked in 2002 is actually probably one of the gold standards anywhere in the world right now. We just have to make sure that it's being implemented right and expanded so it's covering more than just 7% of the pipelines in this country.
Bottom line is, should Americans be afraid of what's in their backyard after what happened in San Bruno?
I don't think Americans need to be afraid, but they need to be aware. They need to know where the pipelines are. They need to know who to call and how to respond if they see things going on. And they need to help push to make sure the companies are doing what the regulations say and the regulations are strong enough, that the regulators have the resources they need to keep everybody safe, and that even local government starts thinking about these things, because often these pipelines were put in rural areas and now local government has allowed buildings to be put right near the pipelines.
So what are we looking at here?
Well, this is a remotely controlled valve that was put in on this pipeline after the explosion here in Bellingham, and what it does is it allows the control room to shut this valve off to keep the fuel from flowing into the creek.
Why is that so important?
Well, it's really important for both liquid and gas lines because it'll reduce the amount of damage if a pipeline bursts. When this pipeline failed before, it's all up gradient here, almost 20 miles. So 20 miles worth of this fuel of this pipeline flowed into the creek because they had no way to shut it off here.
If they had one in San Bruno, what would have been the outcome?
Well, I think the major outcome, at least with San Bruno, would have been they could have shut it down almost immediately from the control room versus having to find someone with a key to drive to the valve and turn it off manually.
Yeah. So it might have actually made a difference in how quickly they were able to get that gas shut off.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the pipeline would have exploded anyway, but you wouldn't have had the pipeline, dumping gas into the neighborhood for an hour and a half before they shut off the valve.